right, we're on to chapter 2 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, called The Search for Mr. Hyde. Last time we were introduced to Mr. Hyde, he's a stumpy little man who trampled a girl in the middle of the night in London and then was blackmailed essentially into paying the family of the girl £100 to have them shut up and not call the cops. But he paid with a check signed by another man. And this other man apparently is somebody that our protagonist, Mr. Utterson, knows. And so now he's intrigued and he wants to find out who this Mr. Hyde is. And that's where we're picking up this time. So, the search for Mr. Hyde. That evening, Mr. Utterson came home to his bachelor house in somber spirits and sat down to dinner without relish. What? No relish? No. Relish could be like pickle relish, but in this case, relish means enjoyment. He didn't enjoy his dinner. It was his custom of a Sunday, when his meal was over, to sit close by the fire, a volume of some dry divinity on his reading desk, until the clock of the neighboring church rang out the hour of 12, when he would go soberly and gratefully to bed. So this is how Utterson spends his evenings. This is unfortunate. He would sit in his. This is on Sunday nights. He would sit in his room with the Bible essentially, or some interpretation of the Christian religion, and read it carefully, thinking about it until midnight, when he would go to bed. On this night, however, as soon as the cloth was taken away, he took up a candle and went into his business room. Actually, I want to pause here and talk about something in Victorian times. It's not really the same anymore. Back in the day, people tended to live and work in the same location. So if you were a lawyer, you would have your apartment or your house, and in it would be a business room, a room usually that had a door that connected to the street, separate from your main house's door. And in that room, you would like walk from your house to work. You'd literally walk through a door and be in your workplace, and you would sit and do your business. And then at the end of your business day, you just walk back into your house. It was a pretty simple arrangement. Even doctors worked this way. Doctors had like their office, which was attached to their house where they lived. And this was true for like grocers, like the grocery store, for example, or the butcher shop would be the downstairs, and then the upstairs floor would be where the butcher lived. And so you don't see this as much anymore, but it was a very typical arrangement in Victorian times. So, and went into his business room. There he opened his safe, took from the most private part of it a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will. First time Jekyll's been mentioned. He's a title character. A will, of course, is the document about who gets your property or your money when you die. And he sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. A clouded brow probably means his eyebrows are like pinched together. The will was holographed, for Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. This is before copy machines. When there's a holograph of something, it means it's a copy, essentially, of it. Provided not only, the will, provided not only that in the case of the decease, meaning the death of Henry Jekyll, MD is medical doctor, DCL, LLD, FRS. In other words, Dr. Jekyll is eminently educated. He's got a ton of degrees. These are all degrees and titles after his name. All his possessions were to pass into the hands of his, quote, friend and benefactor Edward Hyde, but also that in the case of Dr. Jekyll's, quote, disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay, and free from any burden or obligation beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. This document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. It offended him, both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was the immodest. And hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. Now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. It was already bad enough when the name was but a name of which he could learn no more. It was worse when it began to be clothed upon with detestable attributes, and out of the shifting, insubstantial mist that had so long baffled his eye, there leapt up the sudden, definite presentiment of a fiend. I thought it was madness, he said, as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe. And now I begin to fear it is disgrace. So Utterson is Dr. Jekyll's lawyer, apparently. And Dr. Jekyll's will has bothered him ever since he received it. In fact, he refused to make the will itself because the will says that if Jekyll dies, everything goes to a Mr. Edward Hyde. But worse than that, it says that if he disappears for 3 calendar months, everything he has goes to Edward Hyde. This doesn't make sense. First off, Utterson's known Jekyll for years and has never met this Mr. Hyde, never heard of him, and it used to bother him because he had no idea who this Mr. Hyde was and why he was getting all of Jekyll's stuff. And now, but also, this 3 month clause, I mean, Hyde could just lock Jekyll in a closet for 3 months and then get all of his stuff. That's not normal. You don't normally write that sort of a clause in a will, and so it bothered him. And now that he's starting to realize who this Hyde is, the kind of guy that goes out at 4 o'clock in the morning and tramples a 10-year-old girl, it's becoming worse. And he's afraid that it is blackmail. I begin to fear it's disgrace. So what Utterson is thinking is that this Mr. Hyde has something on Jekyll. Jekyll maybe was crazy or wild in his youth and did something unfortunate. Like, I know what you did last summer, whether he murdered somebody or slept with somebody he shouldn't, or did something really bad, and that Hyde knows about it, and he's using this to force this unfortunate relationship with Jekyll. Anyway, with that, he blew out the candle and put on a greatcoat and set forth in the direction of Cavendish Square, that citadel of medicine where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, had his house and received his crowding patients. If anyone knows, it will be Lanyon, he had thought. We'll keep reading. The solemn butler knew and welcomed him. He was subject to no stage of delay, but ushered direct from the door to the dining room where Dr. Lanyon sat alone over his wine. Here's a distinction. Lanyon drinks wine when he's alone, and Utterson drinks gin because he hates it. This is a description of Dr. Lanyon. He was a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman with a shock of hair prematurely white, and a boisterous and decided manner. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, he sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. The geniality, as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye, but it reposed on genuine feeling. For these two were old friends, old mates both at school and college, both thorough respecters of themselves and of each other. And what does not always follow, men who thoroughly enjoyed each other's company. So, Utterson goes to his friend's house, Dr. Lanyon. Turns out that Dr. Lanyon and Utterson went to college together. It turns out they had a third friend who was a really good friend of theirs, Dr. Jekyll. So Jekyll, Lanyon, and Utterson all went to high school together. They all went to college together. They've known each other forever. But really interesting, the description of Lanyon and how he differs from Utterson. Lanyon's a traditionally Victorian man. He's very emotional. He's very hearty and happy. You see that, like when Utterson goes to shake his hand, he shakes it with both of his hands. And you can tell just by the way he talks that he's a much more emotional guy, more in tune with his emotions and more willing to laugh and smile and, all of those kinds of things. After a little rambling talk, the lawyer led up to the subject which so disagreeably preoccupied his mind. I suppose, Lanyon, said he, you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has. I wish the friends were younger. Or it's a Dr. Hibbert from The Simpsons kind of line. But I suppose we are. What of that? I see little of him now. Indeed, said Utterson. I thought you had a bond of common interest. In other words, aren't you both doctors? We had, was the reply. It's more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind. And though, of course, I continued to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and have seen devilish little of the man. Such unscientific balderdash, added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple. Whatever strange Damon and Pythias, that's an allusion to a Greek myth about two guys who were essentially like best friends and brothers. But this is interesting. Apparently, Lanyon and Jekyll do not speak anymore, and they have had a fight about science. Jekyll has expressed a belief in something that he calls unscientific balderdash. That's interesting. This little spirit of temper was somewhat of a relief to Mr. Utterson. They have only differed on some point of science, he thought. And being a man of no scientific passions except in the matter of conveyancing, apparently he likes trains and cars, but nothing else that science has to offer. Um, he even added, "It is nothing worse than that." He gave his friend a few seconds to recover his composure and then approached the question he had come to put. "Did you ever come across a protege of his, one Hyde?" he asked. "Hyde?" repeated Lanyon. "No, never heard of him. Since my time." That was the amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him to the great dark bed on which he tossed to and fro, until the small hours of the morning began to grow large. It was a night of little ease to his toiling mind, toiling in mere darkness and besieged by questions. 6 o'clock struck on the bells of the church that was so conveniently near to Mr. Utterson's dwelling, and still he was digging at the problem. Hitherto, meaning up until now, it had touched him on the intellectual side alone, but now his imagination also was engaged, or rather enslaved. And as he lay and tossed in the gross darkness of the night and the curtained room, Mr. Enfield's tale went by his mind in a scroll of lighted pictures. He would be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city, then of a figure of a man walking swiftly, then of a child running from the doctor's, and then these met, and that human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on regardless of her screams. Or else he would see a room in a rich house where his friend, that's Jekyll, lay asleep, dreaming and smiling at his dreams. And then the door of that room would be opened, the curtains of the bed plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given. And even at that dead hour he must rise and do its bidding. The figure in these two phases haunted the lawyer all night, and if at any time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through sleeping houses, or move the more swiftly, and still the more swiftly, even to dizziness, through wider labyrinths of lamp-lighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. So he has this dream in which he keeps seeing the scene of the stumpy little man stamping on this girl. And then he sees his friend Jekyll being woken up in the middle of the night and forced to pay a bill for this guy. And it's bothering him, and it seems to get a little more crazed. Like he's seeing him move faster and faster, like this overhead grid pattern of the city, and you can see this Hyde moving around there and stomping on girl after girl, kind of like a crazy Pac-Man game or something. Um, and still the figure had no face by which he might know it. Even in his dreams, it had no face, or one that baffled him and melted before his eyes. Oh, that's creepy. Apparently, he catches Hyde sometimes in his dreams and grabs him, and he turns around, and as he turns around and tries to see his face, it's like, "Ooh," like melts away and just leaves a blank. Ugh, that's just, ugh, it's a nightmare. Um, let's see, one that melted before his eyes, and thus it was that there sprang up and grew apace in the lawyer's mind a singularly strong, almost an inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. If he could but set eyes on him, he thought, the mystery would lighten and perhaps roll altogether away, as was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. He might see a reason for his friend's strange preference, or bondage, call it which you please, and even for the startling clause of the will. At least it would be a face worth seeing. The face of a man who was without bowels of mercy, a face which had but to show itself, to rise up in the mind of the unimpressionable Enfield a spirit of enduring hatred. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by street of shops. In the morning, before office hours, at noon, when business was plenty and time scarce, at night, under the face of the fogged city moon. By all lights and in all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found on his chosen post. If he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. Hide and seek. This is a great one-liner. This is worthy of James Bond. If he be Mr. Hyde, I'll be Mr. Seek. I mean, like, that's funny. But whatever the case, it's a stakeout, right? Like, Utterson is spending a lot of time at this door, the door of the story of the door in chapter 1, and he's trying to catch Mr. Hyde and see him. He feels like if he sees this Mr. Hyde, maybe the mystery will unfold itself. And at last his patience was rewarded. It was a fine, dry night, frost in the air, the streets as clean as a ballroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind, drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed, the by street was very solitary, and in spite of the low growl of London from all around, very silent. Small sounds carried far. Domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumor of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of an odd, light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols, he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he is still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. The steps drew swiftly nearer, and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of man he had to deal with. He was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time, and as he came he drew a key from his pocket like one approaching home. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. "Mr. Hyde, I think." Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of the breath. This is great. He turns around, he's like, like some sort of a snake or something. We got this hissing. But his fear was only momentary, and though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough, "That is my name. What do you want?" "I see you are going in," returned the lawyer. "I am an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. You must have heard of my name, and meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me." "You will not find Dr. Jekyll. He is away from home," replied Mr. Hyde, blowing in the key. And then suddenly, but still without looking up, "How did you know me?" he asked. "On your side," said Mr. Utterson. "Will you do me a favor?" "With pleasure," replied the other. "What shall it be?" "Will you let me see your face?" asked the lawyer. Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. "Now I shall know you again," said Mr. Utterson. "It may be useful." That's a threat. So, if Hyde ever did anything bad, Utterson would be able to ID him. He's a lawyer. He's very clearly said this. So I think, this is intended to intimidate or threaten Mr. Hyde. "Yes," returned Mr. Hyde. "It is well we have met, and appropriate that you should have my address." And he gave a number of a street in Soho. Soho at the time, was a bad neighborhood in London, the kind of place with whorehouses and drug dealers and opium dens and all that kind of stuff. Good God, thought Mr. Utterson, can he too have been thinking of the will? But he kept his feelings to himself and only grunted in acknowledgement of the address. So Hyde counters a threat with a threat. He's like, it might be good to know. Utterson is like, look, now I can identify you essentially in a police lineup if I have to. But Hyde is like, yeah, you might need my address so that you can give me all of Jekyll's property when he disappears. That's sort of like the implied subtext of what he just said. "And now," said the other, "how did you know me?" "By description," was the reply. "Whose description?" "We have common friends," said Mr. Utterson. "Common friends?" echoed Mr. Hyde a little hoarsely. "Who are they?" "Jekyll, for instance," said the lawyer. "He never told you," cried Mr. Hyde with a flush of anger. "I did not think you would have lied." "Come," said Mr. Utterson, "that is not fitting language." The other snarled aloud into a savage laugh. Something like that. And the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he had unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. The lawyer stood a while, when Mr. Hyde had left him, the picture of disquietude. Then he began slowly to mount the street, pausing every step or two and putting his hand to his brow like a man in mental perplexity. The problem he was thus debating as he walked was one of a class that is rarely solved. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He had borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with a husky, whispering, and somewhat broken voice. All of these were points against him, but not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing, and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. "There must be something else," said the perplexed gentleman. "There is something more. If I could find a name for it. God bless me, the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic, shall we say? Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? Or is the mere radiance of a foul soul that thus transpires through and disfigures its clay continent? The last, I think, for, oh, my poor old Harry Jekyll, if ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend." All right, so this is pretty cool. This is a first-hand account of what Hyde looks like. And we didn't really get a satisfactory explanation from Enfield. And so we get a better description from Utterson himself. So let's look at this. Hyde is pale and dwarfish and gives an impression of deformity. He feels deformed even though you can't name what's deformed about him. He has an ugly smile, and he's sort of got a paradoxical temperament. He's both timid and scared seeming, but also bold and ready to commit murder, maybe. He speaks with a husky, whispery, sort of broken voice, like some sort of, oh, it sounds unfortunate. And all of these are bad, but if you stack all these on top of each other, it doesn't account for the, like, he's more evil than the sum of his parts, I guess. If you add them all up, it doesn't account for the evilness that Utterson feels. And so he's trying to figure out what it is. And he mentions Dr. Fell, which would be an illusion that you can look up if you want to. Actually, let's do that. Dr. Fell is apparently a children's rhyme. "I do not like thee, Dr. Fell, the reason why I cannot tell. But this I know, and know full well, I do not like thee, Dr. Fell." So clearly that's what's being referenced there. Interesting, again, but it fits. I'm going to get back to it eventually. So there's that. But also he's called troglodytic. That word means like a caveman. There's something of the caveman. There's something of the sort of pre-human cave dweller about this Mr. Hyde. And that's maybe a connection back to your Darwin and there's something maybe ape-like about him. I think that's interesting. So there's that. But I like this bit. He says, what is this guy's deformity? I can't tell. Maybe his deformity is that his soul is so foul, so evil, that the evilness of his soul is his deformity. It's not a physical deformity. It's an internal deformity of the soul that radiates through him to an onlooker. And maybe that explains why Enfield hated him so much and why all the women and even the doctor hated him, and why Utterson, who, by the way, is somebody who's not emotional, and we've gone out of our way to tell you how unemotional he is, also feels the same level of hatred towards him. At the end, he says, I like this, "If ever I read Satan's signature on a face, it's on that of your new friend." Apparently, Hyde is so evil that he's like a masterpiece of Satan, and Satan would have signed him like Satan, like a piece of Satan's artwork or something. I think that's disturbing and fascinating as well. Anyway, around the corner of the by street, there was a square of ancient, handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate, and let in flats and chambers to all sorts and conditions of men, map engravers, architects, shady lawyers, and the agents of obscure enterprises. One house, however, second from the corner, was still occupied entire, and at the door of this, which wore a great air of wealth and comfort, though it was now plunged in darkness except for the fanlight, Mr. Utterson stopped and knocked. Okay, so it's important that you sort of picture this. So the story of a door, is on, say, this side of a block. Utterson walks up and over and down the other side of the block, same part of the street at the door of the house. So this is an area of London that's sort of fallen into disrepair, and most of the houses, which are big, old, grand sort of mansions, have been separated up and sublet in individual rooms and things like that. But there's one house that still is owned by one person and kept entire, and that's the door he's knocking at. A well-dressed elderly servant opened the door. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "I will see, Mr. Utterson," said Poole, admitting the visitor as he spoke into a large, low-roofed, comfortable hall paved with flagstones, warmed after the fashion of a country house by a bright open fire, and furnished with costly cabinets of oak. "Will you wait here by the fire, sir, or shall I give you a light in the dining room?" "Here, thank you," said the lawyer, and he drew near and leaned on the tall fender. This hall, in which he was now left alone, was a pet fancy of his friend, the doctor's, and Utterson himself was wont to speak of it as the pleasantest room in London. But tonight there was a shudder in his blood. The face of Hyde sat heavy on his memory. He felt, what was rare for him, a nausea and distaste of life, and in the gloom of his spirits he seemed to read a menace in the flickering of the firelight on the polished cabinets, and the uneasy starting of the shadow on the roof. He was ashamed of his relief when Poole presently returned to announce that Dr. Jekyll had gone out. "I saw Mr. Hyde go in by the old dissecting room, Poole," he said. "Is that right when Dr. Jekyll is from home?" "Quite right, Mr. Utterson, sir," replied the servant. "Mr. Hyde has a key." "Your master seems to repose a great deal of trust in that young man, Poole," resumed the other musingly. "Yes, sir, he does indeed," said Poole, "and we have all our orders to obey him." "I do not think I ever met Mr. Hyde?" asked Utterson. "Oh, dear, no, sir. He never dines here," replied the butler. "Indeed, we see very little of him on this side of the house. He mostly comes and goes by the laboratory. Well, good night, Poole." "Good night, Mr. Utterson," and the lawyer set out homeward with a very heavy heart. All right, you got to understand, I think, the logistics here. So Jekyll's house crosses the whole block. The front is the house, and then there's like a courtyard or a garden, and then there's another room on the back, and that room is referred to as the old dissecting room. You're going to get a little bit more information on this as the story goes on, but essentially, the house that Jekyll owns now used to be owned by a surgeon, a doctor, and so his house was separated by a garden or a yard from his workplace, which was where he did all of his surgery. And Jekyll bought this place, and he lives in the house, and he turned the place where the doctor used to do his surgery into a chemistry lab. Dr. Jekyll's not a medical doctor. Dr. Lanyon is a medical doctor, but Dr. Jekyll is a chemist. So his doctorate is in chemistry. And I think that's important for you to know, too. He's a scientist, not a medical doctor. Anyway, and the lawyer set out homeward with a very heavy heart. "Poor Harry Jekyll," he thought. "My mind misgives me he's in deep waters. He was wild when he was young, a long while ago to be sure, but in the law of God there is no statute of limitations. Aye, it must be that. The ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace, punishment, coming pede claudo, years after memory has forgotten and self-love condoned the fault." And the lawyer, scared by the thought, brooded a while on his own past, groping in all the corners of memory lest by chance some jack-in-the-box of an old iniquity should leap to light there. His past was fairly blameless. Few men could read the rolls of their life with less apprehension, yet he was humbled to the dust by the many ill things he had done, and raised up again into sober and fearful gratitude by the many he had come so near to doing, yet avoided. So remember that Utterson has known Jekyll for years, and Jekyll was a bit of a wild teen and 20-year-old guy, and maybe he did something really unfortunate that he's being blackmailed for now. And so then Utterson thinks back on his own life, what bad he's done, what he could be blackmailed for, and who might know it. Let's see. And then, by a return to his former subject, he conceived a spark of hope. This Master Hyde, if he was studied, thought he, must have secrets of his own. Black secrets, by the look of him. Secrets compared to which poor Jekyll's worst would be like sunshine. Things cannot continue as they are. It turns me cold to think of this creature stealing like a thief to Harry's bedside. Poor Harry. What awakening. And the danger of it, for if this Hyde suspects the existence of the will, he may grow impatient to inherit. Aye, I must put my shoulder to the wheel. If Jekyll will but let me, he added, if Jekyll will only let me. For once more he saw before his mind's eye, as clear as transparency, the strange clauses of the will. So now we met Hyde. We found out that Hyde's door is connected with Jekyll's house. We've tried to see Jekyll, but Jekyll is not in. And Utterson has come up with this idea that if he can study Hyde, maybe he can blackmail Hyde and thereby save Jekyll from whatever blackmail Hyde is doing to him. And so that's the end of the chapter, and it's going to bring us to the next chapter, which is called Dr. Jekyll Was Quite at Ease. We'll save that one for next time.